Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build great teams. I'm the author of the book, Mission First People Always, the definitive guide to balancing people and performance. And it's available on Amazon or wherever you buy your books online. I'm also a trainer, consultant, and coach focused on leader and team development. Let me remind you, as I always do, please subscribe or follow, leave a review, and tell a friend about our podcast. I do this podcast because I sincerely want to help people lead better and to get more done with and through people. I believe everyone I invite to be a guest on the podcast can add value to your leadership journey, and I like to showcase talented people who care deeply about healthy organizations and good leadership, as I do. And today is no exception. This is one of those episodes where I don't know exactly what's going to happen or where our conversation will go, but I'm so impressed with my guests and have great respect for their accomplishments that I wanted to have the conversation. And so with this spirit of adventure, we're going to talk about my favorite topic, Mission First, People Always Leadership, but with a specific focus on how it looks in real life under difficult circumstances with different people and bringing in different perspectives. To some extent, we're going to go back to some basic ideas related to leadership and teamwork and how these ideas are validated in practice. But then we're going to rev things up again and talk about authentic leadership and how it must be based on self-leadership, which requires a holistic approach. I think it's going to be a fun conversation, and I'm excited to share it with you. My guests today come from very different backgrounds, yet work together and collaborate extremely well. Colonel George Reynolds, U.S. Army retired, has spent 43 years of his life supporting and defending the Constitution of the United States as a soldier and a civil servant in the Department of Defense. He supported the NATO-led military operations in Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom, and Operation Resolute Support as a senior advisor, where he provided critical guidance, advice, and mentorship in the areas of good governance and sustainable institutional capacity building to key leaders within the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan security ministries. As with his time in uniform, these missions called on his skills in change management and leadership development and leveraged his emotional and cultural intelligence. Since 2015, George has served as program and course manager of the Defense Security Cooperation University's Ministry of Defense Advisors and Defense Advisors Program training endeavors. During this time, he has planned, managed, and executed the training for over 400 career DoD career employees and United States military service members, enabling them to effectively serve globally with strategic partner countries at the ministerial and cabinet levels. His colleague Colleen Mizuki teaches with George at the Defense Security Cooperation University and co-leads Trellis Life Management, a leadership and training consultancy that largely works with government agencies in the greater Washington, D.C. area with George. She has 20 years of experience in coaching and designing and delivering performance enhancement, learning and development, and resilience programs. Her expertise and passion centers around programs based in the science and practice of mindfulness techniques, mind, brain, and body optimization, and self-regulation for greater well-being and improved performance. She brings a unique background in psychotherapy and body-based therapy, coaching, training mindfulness, yoga practice, and hard science. She has experience working with a very diverse client base, including corporate, military, academic, diplomatic, social services, cyber hackers, information technology, R&D, and nonprofit organizations with clients from over 25 countries. And I'm thrilled to have both of these great folks on the show with me today. George and Colleen, welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here, Mike. Thank you very much for extending the invitation.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Mike. We're really looking forward to speaking with you.
Well, it's my pleasure. Now you're in Washington, the greater Washington D.C. area, the DMV, as they say somewhere. Is that correct?
That is correct. We're actually sitting in Alexandria, Old Town Alexandria, just across the river from all the beautiful monuments.
What a beautiful place. And perhaps the reason you're there is because you do a lot of work with the federal government, but you don't limit your work to government agencies. We'll talk about the kind of work you do, but really the focus of our conversation today is to dig deep into some basic aspects of leadership, the practice of leadership, how to integrate the brain, the mind, the body in a more holistic approach. So, as I said in my intro, I'm not sure exactly where this conversation is going to go, but I'm excited to have it with you. So, you ready to jump in?
We're ready. Let's do it.
All right. So we'll invite both of you to come into the conversation whenever you feel it's appropriate. Let's start with George. George, you've been leading and developing leaders for 40 plus years. And if you're like me, you've read countless articles and books about leadership. You've been through so much leadership training, you can't keep track of it all. But if you could boil leadership success down to one or two things, what would they be? Where would you go with that?
Well, and that's a very, very, very good question. I would say that for me, again, if I look through my own lens at what best prepared me to be a leader, it began with mentorship. And mentorship comes in a number of ways, obviously. My first mentors were my parents, who actually celebrate their 65th wedding anniversary today. And I had tremendous role models growing up in my parents. They prepared me to not just be a leader, but more importantly, to be a follower, which is a critical element to leadership. I don't think you can be a good leader if you're not also a good follower. And they set the foundation. And then to take the mentorship step further, from a direct leadership perspective, from my time in military, my first military mentor was an individual named Sergeant First Class Mac Marine. Now, just to give you a perspective of how fortunate I was, and that's when I was a basic trainee recruit in 1979 at Fort Benning, Georgia. Sergeant Marine ended up, his final assignment, he was the Command Sergeant Major of the United States Army Infantry School. And so he was my first military mentor. And again, like my parents set the foundation for my life, he certainly set the foundation for the military leadership aspect of my life. So I was very fortunate.
So you mentioned your parents, you mentioned someone who was influential during your time in basic training at Fort Benning. These folks were sort of in your life without you doing anything. We have our parents. Fortunately, you had great parents. I have great parents, and great parents are the set the tone for our lives. Sergeant First Class, who influenced you at Fort Benning, he was assigned to be part of your life in a sense. So I'm curious, if mentorship is so important, should we as leaders, should the folks listening to the podcast be proactively looking for mentors? And how do we create that relationship? In other words, do mentors come to us, or do we go out and find mentors?
It's an excellent question. And I would say it's a little bit of both. Throughout my subsequent career in the Army, which ended in 2010, I had a number of individuals that came to me because they thought, or they noticed that I needed some guidance. And I'm not talking about individuals in many cases that were my superiors. I'm talking about, in theory, subordinates. Some of the best mentoring I received beyond what I received from Sergeant Vereen at basic training. Whereas, ultimately I went to officer candidate school at the recommendation of Sergeant Vereen. And I was able ultimately to be commissioned. And as a young lieutenant, especially, I had NCOs, right, who are in theory subordinate to me, come to me, take me under their wing, and provide me with mentorship to help me become a better leader and help me become a more effective leader. So in that case, they reached out to me. As career progressed, I also sought the advice of superiors whose leadership styles I admired, or certain aspects of their leadership styles I admired, or some of the traits they demonstrate. And so it really, it's a combination of both. On one hand, I'm very fortunate in that there were individuals, in most cases, again, they were subordinates who came to me and provided me with guidance. And then in other cases, I was observant enough to pick up on some traits that appealed to me. And so I reached out to those individuals. And I think in essence, what it's done for me is it allowed me to understand and appreciate the importance of mentorship. And as a leader, I would go out and actively seek anybody to mentor. And so I really embraced that concept, and I leveraged it throughout my career with a myriad of individuals, subordinates, individuals that weren't even in my chain of command. Frankly, anybody that I thought would benefit from some guidance. And that made me feel like, on one hand, very altruistic. On one hand, I was paying back, but for the most part, I realized what a benefit it was to me. And so I wanted to do that for anybody else that I could. Long answer, I apologize, but mentorship is important.
I appreciate it, George. I think the shared experience we have from the Army really sets, if young officers, young leaders are open to receiving that guidance, especially from in that system, usually older, usually more experienced non-commissioned officers who, according to the rank structure, aren't our superiors, but in a sense, they bring, well, not in a sense, they actually bring tremendous experience and wisdom and hands-on knowledge of how to get things done. I think that system, if we take advantage of it, is incredibly useful. I've had so many times where, someone would say to me, a first sergeant, a platoon sergeant would say, LT, let's talk about it. Or sir, that's NCO business. Let me take care of that for you. And let me tell you why. Let me tell you how I would do that. And so where I'm going with that, this statement is, doesn't being mentored require a good dose of humility? Can one be mentored without humility? And what characteristics does a good mentor need to be a good mentor? Does the mentor need to be abundantly benevolent and have this incredible wisdom and approach to share? What are the tools that a mentor needs, and what are the tools that what is the mindset of a mentee?
Again, a wonderful question. And to your direct point, yes, humility is, I think, the critical component for someone who is being approached as a mentee. It certainly, in the example you just gave as a lieutenant, if someone in theory subordinate comes to you and wants to provide you with some guidance, you have to be humble enough to accept that and to recognize the importance of that, and then to accept it. So it's certainly humility. From a mentor's perspective, mentor I think has to have a degree of empathy, because you're mentoring because perhaps you realize what that individual is experiencing, in the case of a young lieutenant, by not knowing what they don't know, right? And so if you don't have a degree of empathy, you more than likely will not recognize that. And even if you do recognize it, you will be probably less likely to want to do something to help. So it's empathy. It's the ability to communicate, both project communication, transmit, but probably more importantly, to receive and to listen to the concerns of the mentee. And then as the mentee, you also have to have a degree of communication skills so that you can receive what you're hearing. But you have to be, I think, first and foremost, humble enough and be able to discern that it's not really criticism. It's really an expression of support and assistance. Colleen, you
Yeah,
have anything to add?
let's get Colleen into the conversation. I'm just fascinated by how different your backgrounds are. And I spoke to that as I introduced you both at the top of the show, but yet you work together so well. That at least that's my observation. So Colleen, jump in here. From your perspective, how important is empathy to effective leadership?
You're absolutely right. George and I come from vastly different backgrounds. And the reason that we do, I think there are many reasons, but one is that just exactly what we're talking about here, humility, empathy, but also in regarding not only what allows us to work well together, but the question of mentorship, it's respect for the other person's context, where they're coming from, respect for what they bring to the table, and curiosity. So one of the things I wanted to throw something in that I was thinking about as I was listening to George's response to your wonderful questions. And I believe, and I think that this helps every leader as well as everybody being mentored or the mentor him or herself. And that is seeing every experience and everybody as a potential teacher. That enables us to be mentored without, as George was saying, without feeling defensive. And it allows mentors also to be better mentors, because in my mind, they're asking powerful questions. They're being curious as well as guiding directly. So, but I think empathy is important for any human interaction. So bottom line is that's one of the most fundamental capacities that we have for growth, for learning, for development.
So seeing everyone as a potential teacher, that's a powerful statement. It does indeed require us to approach every interaction with a sense of curiosity. And I think humility is part of that. We have to put aside preconceived notions and be open to learning. That may have just made the quote of the episode right there, Colleen. I don't know if it will or not, but that was a good one. Let's continue our this talk about empathy, because I've been thinking more and more and more about empathy of late. I used to think that people were born with empathy and they just had this ability to feel what was going on with someone else, and it was sort of an intuitive thing. And then my wife told me that she thought I was born without the empathy gene. It was a birth defect of some sort. And so I felt really bad about that for a while, until I changed my mindset and started to recognize that empathy can be learned. It can be a cognitive process. So I don't know if you agree with that or not, but what does it take to become more empathetic or an empathic leader? Can we, in fact, develop the skill of empathy? Is it, in fact, a skill that can be learned?
Well, I'd like to jump in on that first, and my response will probably differ in some ways from George's, and I definitely want to hear what George has to say, but it points to our different backgrounds. So I'm going to geek out just for a moment. The thing about it is, you're right. We are, just like we're born with a different capacity for doing mathematics or drawing a great picture or playing basketball. We are born with different capacities for empathy, but as human beings, we have real estate, i.e. neurons, brain cells, that enable us to grow that capacity. Like I can become better in math, even though I'm not a natural mathematician. And so it does become a skill that is and a capacity that can grow. And so we all, I think, could use more empathy. I shouldn't say that. There are some people who have so much that it overwhelms them, but yes, in response, yes, it can be developed, it can be enhanced, just like any innate capacity. Right.
So, George, maybe you can pick up there and tell us how one can increase his or her capacity for empathy.
Okay, so and I mentioned earlier, my two parents are my first mentors and role models. I learned empathy from my mother, and she was my primary caregiver because my dad many times was absent, working 2, sometimes 3 jobs. And had that not been the case, and my dad was my primary caregiver or my primary influence, I certainly would not have had the foundational level of empathy that I needed to move out on and grow. And so I think empathy comes, it's inherent, but like Colleen said, there, you have the capacity to develop it. And so I think the way you develop it, for me anyway, as I look back, is I started to really listen to people, to what they had to say. I took the time to understand the situations of their lives, and I was able to do that through listening, getting to know them. And as I developed those relationships, and in this case, I'm thinking about subordinates in my time in the Army, because I took the time to get to know them, because I listened to what was going on in their lives and the lives of others close to them, I was able to gain a greater appreciation for what it felt to be them, and to understand the things that they were dealing with. So I think it's life's experiences and one's willingness to embrace and process those experiences that help them develop their level of empathy. And for me, being an empathetic leader, been told that I was by many people, both subordinates and superiors. I think it has served me incredibly well. In fact, that's the one attribute about me, or one characteristic trait, which I think has served me the best as a leader, and that's my level of empathy.
Let's continue this line of conversation, George, and talk about something you and I have spoken about in the past off air, and that's this idea of mission first, people always. The title of the podcast, it's a title of a book I wrote, and it's something that we as Army officers, it was kind of a mantra we live by. That's where I first heard that expression. But the reason I wrote my book was because I thought people might need some practical advice on how to actually live out mission first, people always leadership. So I'm interested from your perspective. What does it mean to be a mission first, people always leader? And what does it look like in practical terms?
Before I just, say that, I have to note that I've had that as my tagline, if you will, in my signature block since my early days as a lieutenant. And in fact, I've used it so long, I thought I actually wrote it. So I co-opted it, and but that's fine because it's a phrase that I live by. And what it means to me is, yes, as military officers or leaders in general, especially in the private sector, we have a job that has to be done, right? And as leaders, it's our job to motivate our subordinates to achieve that end state. Hence, that's the reason for our being, if you will, is to get the job done. So I'm cognizant, or mission first, underscores the need to get the job done. But the people always aspect of it, for me anyway, indicates that, yeah, job's number one. And sometimes, especially in combat, it comes at the expense of the people. But the bottom line is, fundamentally, if you don't always put your people first, and by first, I mean being cognizant of the things that are going on in their lives, understanding that, there are issues beyond the surface that, are impacting them and their families. And if you're not empathetic enough to understand those and understand the impacts they have on the people who are responsible for completing the mission, then you're not going to complete the mission regardless of how effective your leadership style or your leadership attributes are. You're just not going to get it done if you haven't taken care of your people. It's not your leadership style that's your most significant combat multiplier. It's the people you lead. And it's just not the people you directly lead. It's their families in the case of the military. And so if they're not always your concern, the mission will never succeed.
So it seems as though leadership effectiveness is far more than competency. It involves and requires a sense of authentic concern for the people around you and a commitment to bringing out the best in them, caring for them, their families, and beyond what we immediately see. It's sort of a full-bodied approach to leadership. And so I'd love to get Colleen into the conversation here because I know she's got a lot to say about this to authentic leadership that integrates brain, mind, body, a more systemic approach. Before I do, let me just remind everyone that George and Colleen are co-founders, co-CEOs, co-principals. I'm not sure what else they've titled themselves as, but they have a consulting firm called Trellis Life Management. They operate out of the greater Washington, D.C. area. They are committed to helping humans. I asked before the episode, who's your primary target audience? And they said human beings. And so that was a very broad audience, and they really are committed to helping bring out the best in people and teams. And so let Colleen talk about what that means to her from this brain, mind, body system approach. Colleen, I'm not sure I even fully understand what you mean by that. Some of my listeners might be in the same boat. Help us out here.
No, thank you for that. But first, before I do that, I want to just say that I just had a huge light bulb go on in this conversation about the relationship between empathy and the tagline, mission first, people always. And thank you for that, both of you, because George and I have been talking about that for a long time. And I said, well, if you put the mission, it showed my limitation. Put the mission first, how can people always be counting? But it's the empathy is the link. So you both said it. And so it was beautifully said. So thank you for that. So what does it mean, brain, mind, body system? And kind of like George has been using mission first, people always so long, he thought he wrote it. I don't think I came up with the term brain, mind, body system, but I'm always surprised that others aren't using it because we are a walking system, right? We've got our brains, that is the 3+ pound organ that sort of runs like a CPU of a computer. We have the mind, which is the conceptual entity. And we could talk ad nauseum about the difference between brain and mind, but there are lots of treatises on this. But the mind being the thoughts, the moods, and it is quite different from the brain. And then there's the body piece, which we tend to forget. So what does it mean to be working within the brain, mind, body system? It means we're factoring in how all of those influence each other. So as leaders, for example, as one or both of you have said already, I think you said it particularly recently, Mike, that leadership isn't just some behavior, right? Behaviors come from something. They come from brain activity. They come from conceptual activity. They come from information that we're actually receiving from the body that helps us make decisions and make choices. And so this whole idea of being an embodied leader means that the leader is authentic, as you said, Mike, by understanding that the person that they're leading is not just a brain. It's not just a behavior. It's not just a mind or a mood. It's all of that woven together. So for example, and I'll end with this, the leader that has an embodied leadership capacity means that he or she is not just aware of his or her thoughts, motivations, drivers, mission, but also being tuned into sensations. How do I feel when I'm engaged in empathy? What does that do to me physiologically? Because that information from the body is definitely affecting the brain and the mind. We just need to be aware of it. And so there's a whole movement around somatic leadership. The Strozzi Institute, it's called somatic work. And I think we become better human beings when we understand the information coming from the body that influences our thoughts and our choices and our behaviors. So it's complicated, and I'm not sure if anybody's going to feel like their light bulb went on just now. But I'll stop with that.
Well, let's keep digging in. It does seem to be complicated, but yet the two of you work with organizations to develop leaders using this brain, mind, body systemic approach. So how do you do that? I mean, how do I, as a leader, embrace this approach, develop myself using this approach? How do you help people do that?
Well, I'll get started, and I'm going to use a brief example. And it's somebody that George and I have, since we've been working at this particular company, I've been there for a little over 4 years. And most of that time I've worked with George, for George. He's been my leader. For a short period of time, I went to work on another project. And the individual leading that project was a retired 2-star Marine. We could have been a much better team. He could have been a much better leader if, when faced with conflict and challenges, whether that be time, completing something that we needed to do on the task, if he had been able to be aware of, for example, when he wanted to say, where is the X, Y, or Z? And instead of yelling it and throwing his fists in our faces, he had been able to, for a moment, tap into his own body and realize, wow, I'm really frustrated right now. I'm so frustrated, and I want to use my Marine training to spew venom. If he could have tuned into his heart rate going up, his breathing rate had changed, his fists were clenched, his jaw was tight, and then done something, which is what we teach people to do, to re-regulate his system just a little bit, he would have felt his heart rate go down. His breathing would have come back to normal. He would have felt less like punching somebody, which he would just do verbally, and he would have been able to think more clearly. And we could have felt safer and more productive as a team. So how do we help people? We help them become aware of their first signs of stress so that they can make a decision at that point. Is this a good level of stress that's helping me think clearly, make effective decisions, and build my team? Or is it a level of stress that's going to make me say or do something that's counterproductive and harmful? And learn how to regulate the system in any given moment so our choices are greater about how to behave, what to say, how to make a decision. So that's ultimately what we do, is we help people become aware of the entire system in any given moment, so that it's like exercising, right? It's like building up our entire capacity for greater performance.
So first, to avoid any possible confusion with the listeners, the work that Colleen referred to with regards to the general officer was the job that Colleen and I worked with an organization that supports the Department of Defense. And it really, that combination of time spent together between her and I is what caused us to move on and develop Trust Life Management. So it was a different entity. So I would add to what Colleen said. So she used the example of the general that could have used that information, or he could have used those techniques to avoid, doing the things that he did that were so displeasing to not only Colleen, but many individuals around him. And from my perspective, on a personal note, I've embraced those same techniques about a year ago due to, some catastrophic event that occurred in my life. And it didn't involve death, but for me, it was a very debilitating and depleting period of my time. And I reached out to Colleen and I said, all those things that you have been introduced or trying to introduce to me over the course of the last 4 years that we worked together, brain, mind, body, systematic approach, all those things that I was closed-minded about, didn't think I needed to embrace and would cajole you about. I think I need some of that stuff now. So are you still willing really to reach out and allow yourself to expose me to those things, knowing that for the last 4 years, I sometimes ridiculed you for wanting to do that. And this speaks to now her empathy and her compassion. And she did it without blinking an eye. And I found it so helpful to me during my period of need and my time of need that 5 months later, I approached her and I said, you know what? This has changed my life so dramatically. I think I would like to do this if you will have me as a partner. I think we can do this and allow more people to experience what that general officer couldn't experience, but that I was able to experience by embracing those practices and techniques.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of my conversation with George Reynolds and Colleen Mizuki. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe, follow, leave a review, and tell a friend. You can always learn more about what I do and connect with me at drmikepatterson.com. Hey, come back for the rest of this conversation with Colleen and George. I hope you found value in it, and I think there's more good stuff to come.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.